Hey guys, how's it going? As you can see, I am very busy preparing to ship out the babies. I already shipped out a couple, and I only have a couple left. A lot will be going out next week, but that's why this room's messy. We also have the remnants of, I don't know what hurricane it is, but it's really loud outside, and I can't do a video outside today because of it. I don't know if you guys can hear. Let's see. Probably could hear it, but anyway, today guys, what we're going to be talking about is how much you should feed your Ackie monitors, and we can talk about the different stages of life. Remember, I talked about the different stages of life in my taming video. I talked about my adults, I then kind of talked about my juvenile, almost adult Ackie, that's from my first clutch, and then I talked about the babies. So we could do the same today, talking about feeding and how much I kind of feed and my philosophy going from different stages of life. I see this posted all the time on Ackie Monitor fans, and I get this in my private messages all the time, so hopefully this will help a couple of you guys out. Let's start with the babies, since I kind of already fed them. They're feeding primarily on crickets right now. Now, I totally recommend starting on crickets with baby Ackies if you breed for the first time, or if you get a very young Ackie the first couple months. They are just very motivated to eat crickets, because crickets move a lot, they jump. They provide a lot of the chase that entertain Ackies and give that feeding enrichment that they like. And pardon the little water droplets on the side here, but I just did a misting. So basically, I start out with crickets, right? That's how I begin, and then I kind of start working in Dubia Roaches, because Dubia Roaches are probably the healthiest thing you can offer Ackie monitors. I guess that's the best way to kind of say it. I also, when they get into the adult stages, start adding superworms, but primarily up until about 8 to 12 months, I focus on crickets and Dubia Roaches. So you kind of want to adapt them to Dubia Roaches as they get older. There's no time too soon to add them in. Just make sure they're appropriately sized. Now, in terms of sizing, I'll go ahead and open up my roach bin here and kind of show you what I offer size-wise. I think something like this would be fine for a couple-week-old Ackie. I probably wouldn't start before a couple weeks. Like I said, the first, hopefully you can see that, the first kind of couple weeks you probably want to start off with crickets, and they could be large crickets. Crickets are pretty fine. They like chasing down larger prey. And crickets are not, they don't have that hard exoskeleton, I guess it's an exoskeleton, that Dubia Roaches have. So you can start with large immediately, cricket-wise, but then for Dubia Roaches, they're a little bit harder to down. But you can still give a little bit bigger than you probably thought. This guy's probably half an inch, maybe a little bit more. I'd say half an inch overall when you start feeding them in the first couple weeks, which probably most of you will not. You probably will get them after a month or so. If you really want to start early, maybe even something as little as that guy right there, even though that guy's a little small. But you guys probably won't start them that early unless you're breeding. But that's basically what I start with, Dubia Roach-wise, size-wise, and like I said, crickets, you can start large. Now, how often do I feed these guys? I feed these guys daily. Usually you will do that until at least 6 months, where maybe you could start considering going every other day, depending on how much you give per feeding session. You could even do this a little younger than 6 months, again, depending on how much you give per session. But overall, it's important to give them more food than you would an adult, because they're growing a lot at this stage. You want them to eat pretty much all they can. Obviously, you don't want them to get fat, but that's pretty rare at this young, like I said. It's mostly going into their growth. Now, I'm not really used to keeping one at a time or just a couple, since I breed, and usually whenever I have babies, because I bred them. So I usually throw in a ton for them, probably about 20 to 25 crickets, large crickets. That breaks down to about 3 each if you're looking at a singular dude. And then for Dubia Roaches, I think about 1 to 2 each, so that's about 16 to 20 Dubia Roaches. Now, this could fluctuate a lot at this age depending on what kind of Ackie you have, what kind of build they are. You know, they are all their own personalities and individuals, so sometimes they could be a lot more of an eater, and you really need to go off of that. So basically, that's kind of my average, I would say, and usually what typically works. But some days, they just shred all the crickets up. They just eat all the Dubia Roaches. So I go back and I throw in a little bit more. Some days they don't eat as much, so I cut back the next day. So you kind of don't want to overdo it a little bit. I mean, you don't want a bunch of crickets running around in there and such. So, you know, definitely pay attention. You have to do that and see what works and fluctuate a little bit. but I would say on average that's kind of what I feed babies. And these guys are about a month and a half. And I keep reiterating that they're a month and a half because there's going to be a lot of change in how much they eat and how much you're offering and how frequently in their first year. So I'm really driving that point across. Basically, the amount I'm feeding now and the information I'm giving so far up to this point is probably a good starting out point. That's where you should begin. And then it's kind of tough to guide you guys from there to around the 8 to 12 month point, because it's going to really depend on your individual Ackie. Like I've been saying, you have to see how much you're eating, and if you're noticing these crickets and Dubia Roaches going missing a lot quicker and being eaten a lot quicker, then you probably want to offer a little bit more, and that's what you should use to kind of determine how much you're feeding. That's really the bar you should set yourself, and that's up to you to pay attention to. And another thing to reiterate, I wouldn't worry about obesity and being overweight within their first year. Yes, it's possible, but in their first year, it is probably pretty difficult, I would have to say, to have an obese Ackie because everything is going into becoming an adult, and just like a child, a human child, you know, that's really where all those nutrients are going. So I know that's a main concern though, so that's why I want to bring it up and just discuss it right here briefly. But really, obesity kicks in when they're getting into their adult stages and you haven't transitioned into an adult feeding schedule. Now let's talk about that transition. I have my close to 1-year-old baby Ackie, well not baby anymore, coming up on an adult, but coming out of the juvenile stage. This is from my first clutch. This guy is where you kind of want to be doing that transition, maybe a little bit earlier, around 8 to 10 months instead of around 11 to 12. But you want to start slowing down here. Now this one particularly is a little small. I actually held this one back because of the size. It was a little bit smaller, so I thought this would be a good one to hold back. But usually they're a little bit bigger than this, and then they start slowing down like I said. So you really want to consider how often you're feeding, and then when you lower that down because they're not growing as much, you probably want to boost up the numbers a couple. So what do I mean by that? Basically, I transition to a full adult schedule once they get around 10 to 11 months, maybe even a little bit sooner. Now, my full adult schedule is feeding 3 times a week, and there is one day where there's a miss in 2 days of feeding, if that makes sense. So basically, we have every other day for 2 feedings, and then we'll go like a 3rd day for the last feeding of the week. So is there any real difference between what I do for a juvenile or near adult versus an established adult in terms of feeding? There is, but not too much. It's really the amount. I'm going to put this one back because we all know he or she doesn't love me. The real difference is the quantity and size of the food item you're offering. So right here I have some Dubia Roaches. Olivia, you want to get a little closer for this? You want to touch it?
No, I'm okay, thank you.
Basically, this is a little bit less in size than what I'd offer Asus and Dell or any of my adults. It's almost about an inch, so I'd say about 3/4 of an inch to an inch for a Dubia Roach. That would be a good size. And then continue with the adult crickets or the large crickets. That's probably not going to change at all throughout keeping Ackies. Now for the quantity in the juvenile stage or late juvenile stage, and this might be biased to the higher end because 1, this guy's closer to an adult than a juvenile at this point, and 2, this one's a little bit less in size than he should or she should be at this point, so I am trying to overfeed and compensate for that a little bit. But basically what I offer in quantity for this is around 5 Dubia Roaches of that size or about 7 large crickets. I haven't started superworms on this one yet, but I probably will soon. I usually only offer several for that, so about like 2 to 4 for probably a near adult juvenile and probably even for an adult. But basically that's the quantity I offer. If you want to take a couple numbers off of those, so maybe like try 5 crickets to start, large crickets, and then maybe about 3 or 4 Dubia Roaches of that size I showed, and go from there just to make sure you're not overfeeding at this stage. That's probably a good thing to start with, especially if you're just entering the juvenile stage. And to clarify, when I say juvenile stage, I'm really referring to when they start sexual maturity and getting into that. So that could be around 6 to 7 months, but more typically around 8 months. Now let's talk about feeding adults. Here I have the Dubia Roaches I feed. I do just want to clarify that I normally do not put near this much calcium in there. I have a very rigged calcium bottle, as you can see. I had some problems taking the lid off. and I basically had to puncture a hole in it. It's a mess. My life's a mess. But basically, these are the roaches I feed. I go as high as pretty much the max non-adult Dubia roach, which is 1.5 inches, but usually 1 to 1/4 size of an inch Dubia roach is typically what I feed. Sometimes I'll get some small ones in there for diversity, so there are probably a couple in there that might be as little as 3/4 of an inch, but typically the highest you can go is just below an adult Dubia roach. And you actually can feed adult Dubia roaches. There's no problem with that. It's just I don't know why you would and then not use that for breeding. Now, how many of these roaches do I offer? Those roaches, remember, it's not all max non-adult roaches. There are some lesser ones in there. I give about 7 of them. And that works pretty well in terms of weight. Sometimes, again, even with adults, you might want to fluctuate a little bit based off of how much they're eating, and you want to make sure you monitor their weight. You should visually be able to see if they look like they're getting a little bit chunky or something. And sometimes, well, none of these guys I ever thought were too chunky. I cut back a little bit just to make sure. But basically, I feed about 7 of the roaches, and then for crickets, I put in about 10 in there, and that's kind of each. So I have a parent here, so double that, so that would be 14 roaches, and then double the crickets, that would be about 20 crickets. And I just kind of throw them in there. Asus, you be nice. Just to reiterate, I do also feed them super worms. That's usually about 3 or 4 each. I don't like to feed them too much, so usually, if I can, I'll probably do about 2 or 3, maybe 4, like I said. But they're definitely not the most popular in my mind that I would like to use, or one of the first choices. I just like to be very diverse in my feeding. They actually just had their first hornworms the other day. That's on Patreon. That was really cool and exciting. And there'll be a totally new invert being offered, I think next week, maybe this week. I'll try to turn that into a video, but we'll see what happens. So I'm big on diversity, so I like to offer super worms. They're just definitely the least one used, I would say. And like I said, for the almost adult, pretty much adult guy, I feed 3 times a week, so that's every other day for 2 of the feedings, and then I do a 3rd day for the last feeding, so it's like Monday, or not Monday, it's usually like Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and then I skip Sunday and Monday or something like that. I hope that makes sense. Anyway, that's the video, guys. Let me know if this helped you out with feeding and answered the questions I see out there so much on Ackie Monitor feeding, and how much, how many, when. So let me know. Leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Let's get to a couple announcements before wrapping up. Shout out to the patrons, Darian J, Kat and Rick, behind Bioactive Reptiles, Herb M, Angela L, Smooth Cat, and David T. Thanks so much for being supporters. You too can support the Patreon for as little as $1 a month. Check the top right for more information. Support the channel in a different way by rocking the Professor Herp merch. I'm wearing my Sal's for Chump today. 4 designs will be to the left of my head, right of your screen. Check the description for a Teespring link. That'll take you to all the merch we have to offer. Okay guys, that wraps up the video. Again, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.